We continue, and right now we'll start our discussion, which we call the Arctic in the context of global confrontations. Unfortunately, because of COVID-19 and other pandemic-related difficulties, all of our experts, all of our speakers will be with us online. So I give the floor now to the moderator of a panel, Natalia Viajevo, program manager at the Russian International Affairs Council. She's joining us from Moscow. Natalia, please, the floor is yours. Thank you, Anna. Um, Good morning, dear participants of the Arctic Dialogue. We start our discussion on the Arctic in the context of global confrontations. In recent months, a lot of experts have been talking about the transformation of the Arctic region, and there are many reasons for that. There are a number of new state and non-state actors in the Arctic. We also have climate change, global warming, and the overall situation in global affairs. A number of experts talk about Russia, US, and China projecting their relationships on the Arctic. And they talk that potentially we might see certain conflicts in this region. Other experts believe it would be premature to talk about experts in the Arctic. Today, we have three experts, three specialists who will comment on global standoffs and how they affect the situation in the Arctic. We are joined by Dmitry Suslov. He's Deputy Director of the Center for Comprehensive European and International Research at the Higher School of Economics. So we are also joined by Dr. Ma Din, Associate Professor at the Center for Russia and Central Asia Research at Fudan University, and Timo Koivirova of the Lapland University. I will start with Dmitry Suslov. Hello, Natalia. Hello, colleagues. It's a great honor for me to address you at this conference, even though I could only join you online. I'm one of those experts who think that we already see the overall confrontation between great powers spilling into the Arctic. The role of Arctic in global affairs is getting bigger. The Arctic used to be on the outskirts of global politics. Now it's one of the central regions in the world where we see exacerbating rivalry between great powers, where the interests of the three key global powers collide: the United States, China, and of course, Russia. And we can clearly see this change in international relations in the Arctic. In 2019 and 2020 and then 2021, for 3 years in a row, we saw the US military Arctic strategy. 3 military Arctic strategies in 3 years in a row, published in the US. A strategy by the Department of Defense, a strategy by the Air Force, and a strategy by the US Army. All three strategies say the same thing. The time when the Arctic was an area of cooperation is over. It's over. Today, the Arctic is called a preferential territory for military buildup by the United States. This is what all three of these strategies say. And former State Secretary Mike Pompeo, he was in the Trump administration, and he said this in 2019 at the ministerial conference of the Arctic Council. Pompeo said that the Arctic is now a terrain of foreign competition. This was said under Donald Trump, but we know very well that Biden's policies as far as foreign policy is concerned, is actually very close to Trump's foreign policies. So I think Biden's policies in the Arctic will be very similar, except for climate change matters, of course. On climate change, Biden will be very different from Trump. But as far as the overall rivalry between great powers is concerned, as far as Russia and China are concerned as strategic adversaries, as strategic opponents, we can see that Biden will not be too different from Trump. So why did the Arctic become one of the central areas where great powers collide? It is primarily because two processes overlapped. On the one hand, there is profound transformation of the Arctic because of climate change. And secondly, Russia-US and US-China relations have moved on to systemic confrontation. So these two things overlapped, they coincided. The US is in a systemic confrontation with Russia and China. This is a long-term trend. The policies of the Biden administration indicate that confrontation between the US and China is irreversible, and this is the centerpiece of the US foreign policy. And this confrontation between the US and China affects the Arctic as well. Now, as far as Russia and China are concerned, of course, they are key partners for each other in the world, and in the world in general, and in the Arctic. And China is Russia's #1 partner in developing its key Arctic projects, like, for example, Yamal LNG, the Chinese petroleum company is part of this project, and Russia is China's key partner in developing transport routes between Asia and Europe. This becomes increasingly important to China, considering its confrontation with the United States and increasing volatility in Asia Pacific. On the other hand, Russia and China have fundamental differences as well. They cooperate on particular specific projects in Africa, but there are some fundamental differences in terms of how the Arctic should be managed in the future. So this coincidence between climate change and global confrontation makes the situation in the Arctic today vastly different from what we used to have there in the times of the Cold War. In the Cold War days, again, you had NATO and the Soviet Union in the Arctic, but the Arctic was a peripheral, a marginal territory for the Cold War because it was frozen in more ways than one. It was covered with a thick layer of ice, and the Cold War took place mostly in other places. But today it's different. The Arctic has changed. The Arctic has opened up. It is released from the ice cover. And this, like I said, this overlapped with the growing confrontation between great powers. So now this confrontation is much more active and chaotic in the Arctic. Speaking of climate change, I have to say, because of the special situation in the Arctic northern territories, climate changes in the Arctic have been happening 3 or 4 times as quickly as in the rest of the world. It's basically 3 times as fast as across the globe. And these changes are most likely irreversible. So we have to adapt to this change. We can't reverse it. So on the one hand, this makes Arctic territories more accessible to us. We can develop the economy there, we can develop our transport systems, and this makes Arctic territories more appealing for both Arctic and non-Arctic countries. They all want to take advantage of the fact that the Arctic is now more accessible, more available for mining, for transport. But at the same time, climate change creates new challenges and threats of all sorts: environmental, social, economic, and geopolitical. As far as threats to soft security are concerned because of climate change, this means permafrost thawing, which creates threats to all of the Arctic infrastructure, creates new risks of man-made disasters, threats to the coastline, erosion, floods. This creates threats to the indigenous peoples of the Arctic territories. And this alone, these are non-military threats, non-military soft security risks. This alone will require huge amounts of investment in order to minimize those risks in the Arctic. On the other hand, the biggest geopolitical challenge is now that the US is engaged in confrontation with China and Russia, and China wants to play a bigger role around the world and in the Arctic specifically. Now with the Arctic ice is thawing and with new opportunities emerging in the Arctic, this rivalry between great powers spills into the Arctic. And this spilling results in militarization of the Arctic, increases the overall international rivalry for the Arctic, creates additional risks of military accidents, and stands in the way of economic development of these territories and mitigating soft security risks. So straight away, we can see that negative political and geopolitical consequences of climate change in the Arctic prevents Arctic and non-Arctic countries from taking advantage of the positive effects of climate change for developing these territories. So I see three key aspects of increasing geopolitical competition in the Arctic. And these three trends will only get stronger in the future. Number one, the first trend is that the current system of governance in the Arctic is being undermined. And I'm referring primarily to the Arctic Council. As Arctic opens up, as Arctic ice is thaw, and Arctic and non-Arctic countries are affected by climate change in the Arctic. This is being used by non-Arctic countries to get involved in the Arctic agenda and demand that they are allowed to play a bigger role in managing the Arctic, in governing the Arctic. Non-Arctic countries challenge the existing system of governance in the Arctic, where all governance is done by Arctic countries alone. Non-Arctic countries paint the Arctic as the common inheritance, the common heritage of the entire mankind, something that the entire world should manage. And they want to change the governance model in the Arctic. And I'm referring primarily to China. This escalates tensions between Arctic and non-Arctic countries. This undermines the Arctic Council weakens it as an international institution, and this only exacerbates the overall geopolitical competition in the Arctic. A more active rhetoric by China, let alone its presence in the Arctic, causes China's geopolitical rivals, I'm referring to the United States and its allies, to take countermeasures. They respond to China's more active policies and rhetoric in the Arctic, in keeping with the zero-sum principles, zero-sum game principles. So this is one of the triggers. This is why the Trump administration abandoned its usual principle of delineating hard security and soft security issues. This is why they started pushing for introducing hard security matters in the Arctic Council. That's because of China. As China gets strong in the Arctic and China adopts tougher rhetoric on the Arctic, the United States responded by way of confrontation. So this escalating geopolitical competition further undermines the Arctic Council. The reason why the Arctic Council remained an effective institution in recent decades was because the Arctic Council focused on soft security issues, on environment, northern indigenous peoples, and the Arctic Council refused to include hard security matters in its scope. But today, geopolitics and hard security matters have penetrated the agenda of the Arctic Council, unfortunately. And this is why the Arctic Council is no longer able to operate effectively. For example, the ministerial meeting in 2019 even failed to adopt a final statement. Officially, this was because the Trump administration did not agree with the climate change agenda, but I think the real reason behind that is because of increased US-China and US-Russia confrontation. Number two, why the Arctic became a place of geopolitical confrontation. The second reason is because with the Arctic ices thawing, political military standoff between the US and Russia, the US and China has moved to the Arctic. The Arctic Ocean becomes increasingly available for military presence and military operations. And the United States, as they say openly in their military Arctic strategies, they consider the Arctic Ocean and the Arctic in general as a corridor for projecting their military might, not as a buffer zone, but as a corridor. And the overall geopolitical confrontation between US and China and US and Russia consider each other's policies in the Arctic through the zero-sum mentality lens. They talk about security issues and they shift toward an arms race in the Arctic. So on the one hand, as the Arctic opens up, we see this Arctic hype among Arctic and non-Arctic countries, where many countries want to get more presence in the Arctic, strengthen their military and non-military presence in the Arctic. They realize that they have to fill this vacuum, fill this void created by the opening of the Arctic. If they don't do that, somebody else will take their place. But with great powers confrontation, this increased activity in the Arctic is perceived as a major threat, as a major security threat that calls for countermeasures. So clearly, Russia, Russia takes the lead in building up its military infrastructure in the Arctic, and this is perfectly normal, I think. This is only natural, considering our geographic situation and the fact that Russia depends on the Arctic strategically. And the Arctic plays a major role for Russia's development. It's 10% of Russia's GDP. 10% of our GDP is in the Arctic. But with this confrontation between great powers, the United States perceives Russia's increased military presence in the Arctic as a threat or as a challenge to America, as an unfriendly, as a hostile step by Russia, which calls for an appropriate military response, military countermeasures by the United States. I have mentioned the three military strategies that the US adopted, and all these three strategies refer to Russia as an adversary of the US, and they all call Russia's policies a threat to US national security and international world order. And it is the same with China. As China gets stronger, as China becomes more present in the Arctic, as China starts to use more active rhetoric, the US perceives this as a major threat, and they see the Arctic as an area where Russia and China pose a joint threat to the United States. This results in increased militarization of the Arctic. Like I said, the US builds up its military presence in the Arctic, fifth generation fighter jets. The US creates new military bases in the Arctic, and Russia has to respond to that in turn. And Russia also considers the Arctic as a priority for military infrastructure development. So this militarization of the Arctic stands in the way of economic development of this region and stands in the way of cooperation. And the third trend that I would like to identify, the number three trend, the number three reason why the Arctic became a place of geopolitical confrontation. As Arctic ices thaw, this undermines the current international navigation regulations. We have the existing navigation rules based on Article 234 of the Maritime Law, called on ice-covered seas. And this Article 234 says that Arctic countries, including Russia, of course, have the right to control not only the 12-mile territorial waters, but also 200 exclusive economic zones. And they can exercise exclusively non-discriminatory control of navigation within their exclusive economic zones. So based on this article, of course, Russia has the right to claim the right to control the Northern Sea route. For Russia, maintaining such control is a key element of its national security. Maintaining Russia's control over the Northern Sea route is crucial. This will allow Russia to limit the presence of international vessels in proximity to Russia's borders to control navigation in the Arctic, which is a strategic matter to Russia in terms of security and in terms of economic development.
This also allows Russia to keep sovereignty over its Arctic shores as Russia is increasing the number of partners in its economic projects in the Arctic. Thirdly, this allows Russia to keep controlling the Arctic. The principle is simple. The control is carried out by the Arctic countries under the Arctic Council. Thawing of the ice in the Arctic Ocean, its conversion into a normal sea. This rule in Article 234 is not going to play such an important role. Those countries that have not joined the convention, the Maritime Convention, insist that the Arctic Ocean should be viewed as normal sea. And that can create very serious risks. That means that in the Arctic, we are going to see the same practices related to disputes over different areas of the ocean, like we see in different parts of the world. And we may see something similar to South China Sea situation, where China claims much of that sea, and the United States argues against that, and they send their warships into the region, supporting their military presence there. We have seen a recent incident with an American submarine in the South China Sea. That's an example. That's what we may see developing in the Arctic. For Russia, the Arctic plays a much bigger strategic role in the field of security than South China Sea does for China. You can imagine the prospects that we may be facing. This is not a hypothetical risk. In all the doctrines, in all postures, the United States disagrees with Russian control over the Northern Sea route. They claim that this is a violation of international order, which it is not, because there is Article 234 of UNCLOS, and the United States said that they are going to reject Russia's claims by sending their warships into the region, thus demonstrating their presence in the areas that Russia is trying to control. What is this going to bring about? Russia is going to continue to increase its presence in the Arctic. If Russia loses the capability to protect its right to control shipping in Northern Sea route through international law, through Article 234 of UNCLOS, then Russia is going to try to control that area militarily by increasing its military presence, which is going to increase rivalry between states. It's not going to be supported by other Arctic states and moreover non-Arctic states, and that is going to create another area of tension. Russia needs to control its Arctic waters. Russia needs to control the Northern Sea route to secure its economic development. The money that Russia is going to use to maintain that control, if Article 234 regime is diluted, will mean that there will be more rivalry between states and there will be less cooperation with countries that are also present there, which Russia needs to develop the Arctic region. Now, in conclusion, or instead of the conclusion, I'm going to voice my opinion of what has to be done in this situation, what Russia should do, what can be done to mitigate these risks. We cannot reverse them completely because there is nothing we can do to eliminate rivalry between great powers. We cannot reverse climate change, but we can at least try to mitigate those negative trends. The most obvious thing is that Russia needs to work together with European Arctic countries and Canada to maintain the regime of Article 234 of UNCLOS without a link to ice cover. Maintaining this regime will limit uncontrolled navigation in the Arctic, and it will strengthen the role of the Arctic Council. It will strengthen the principle of Nordic countries or Arctic countries' control over the Arctic. The Arctic Council should endorse a new interpretation of UNCLOS Article 234. It should be linked not to the ice cover, but to the fragility of the Arctic ecosystems. A lack of ice in the Arctic does not make the ecosystems in the Arctic any stronger. In fact, they become more vulnerable. So this new interpretation of UNCLOS Article 234 should mean that unlimited, uncontrolled navigation in the Arctic shall create a threat to the northern ecosystems. It would be too much of a damage for the local environment. So the Arctic countries should control navigation in the Arctic to reduce this environmental damage. And all Arctic states, including Russia, and first of all, Russia should increase the focus on the environmental protection, and all countries should do a lot more. Russia should do much more to protect the Arctic environment. Secondly, we need to oppose the hard security agenda to be added to the Arctic Council. We need to base our work on traditional approach, on soft security. Thirdly, Russia should increase cooperation with Western countries and with the United States in traditional Arctic issues, including climate change. For Biden administration, climate change is a big issue, and that opens up some opportunities. It means that the dialogue on these matters may be possible, and US-Russia confrontation may change in the Arctic. And we also need to control Russia-Chinese relations in the Arctic. I will explain what I mean by this, by control of Russia-China cooperation. Both sides have to realize that their cooperation in the Arctic should be symmetrical. Both sides need each other in the same way and in the same amount, and neither of the countries should try to get unilateral benefits at the expense of the other side. For Russia, China is going to remain the main market for the resources produced in the Arctic. It will be the source of capital and the source of equipment for the Arctic projects. For China, Russia may become a no alternative partner in the Arctic as its relations with the US and its allies deteriorate. So we are looking at the possibility of a symmetrical interdependence between Russia and China. So Russia should promote the principle of controlled openness in the Arctic. In line with this principle, Russia should welcome and promote collaboration with China in individual projects, but it should not allow China to participate in controlling the Arctic. Russia should not delegate the rights to make strategic decisions to Chinese corporations or Chinese government. And also, Russia needs to diversify its non-Western partners in different Arctic projects. Russia should increase cooperation within specific projects with India, Japan, South Korea, and ASEAN countries. That brings me to the end of my talk, and I am ready to take questions if you have any. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Suslov. Very comprehensive talk, very interesting analysis of risks and opportunities. I think we are going to make space for Q&A after all presentations. The next presentation will be made by Dr. Ma of Fudan University. What do you think about the relations between Russia and China in the Arctic against the backdrop of difficult relations between the US and China, US and Russia in other regions and globally? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Natalia. And I will follow Professor Suslov's opinion to share my views about this question. And I have a very simple PowerPoint. Could you see the PowerPoint from my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, thank you. So my topic will be about the cooperation in Arctic. I want to discuss this new agenda for Sino-Russian relations, especially the ideas of Chinese academia and how their views, how their opinions evolution in the past several years. Although the Arctic is a very hot topic for the international community, for the different countries scholars, but in China it's not a very hot topic in past several years. I had explored the development of Chinese research about this topic. We can see from the public reports, the public papers about this topic, we can see that the Chinese academia began to look at this issue mainly after the 2013. Before that year, there are very few articles, very few papers to open discuss this issue. Okay, this is the a very short history about this issue, and about the Chinese academia's interest about the Arctic issues and its relations with the Sino-Russian relations. We can find that the Chinese academias mainly focus on those topics like the economic cooperation between China and Russia in Arctic areas. and the energy cooperation and the transportation, like the Northern Sea route, and also about the blue economic corridor, something like that. And there is the climate and environmental issues in this region for the two countries' cooperation, and then the governance in the Arctic, and then the security and strategic issues, especially like the great powers in the Arctic region, and something like that. And also, this is the main topics, and we can. I mentioned earlier about the evolution of the China's view about this, about the two countries' cooperation in the Arctic. As I said before, the 2013, there are only a few articles about this issue, and they mainly mentioned the topics like the sea routes. Means the northern sea routes between China, between East Asia and Europe, something like that. And then is the energy cooperation, and then is the scientific research cooperation. If we look at carefully about those papers, and we can find that although they mentioned some kinds of cooperations about the two countries' cooperation in this region, there's very few projects they covered. Only some ideas, only some thoughts about the two countries' cooperation. In some content, it may be only the images, because this, for my understanding, this mainly caused by the two countries' cooperation in this region. In that time is not very much. It's only few. That's why the Chinese scholars did not interested in this topic. But the things changed in 2018, and before 2000, you know that in 2017, Chinese President Xi Jinping promoted Chinese President Xi Jinping, when he mentioned the two countries, China and Russia's cooperation in Arctic areas, when he met with Medvedev. And after that, the Chinese scholars began to look at this cooperation very carefully, and examine how these kind of cooperations can affect the two countries' relations, and began to explore what kind of cooperations can do under the framework of the two countries' cooperation. And as we know, from 2013, China have the Silk Road Initiative, Belt and Road Initiative, the Silk Road project. And so when the Chinese scholars discuss this kind of cooperation between China and Russia in the Arctic, they usually put those kind of cooperations under the framework of the Belt and Road Initiative. And as we know, Xi mentioned the Ice Silk Route. This is the very hot topic in that time for the Chinese scholars. When they look at those issues, they mostly discuss how the Ice Silk Route can be carried out, and the possibility, the approaches, and sometimes is the obstacles. About the topic, we can say that the main topic from that time is the Ice Silk Route, and the energy cooperation. We know before 2018, the China and Russia have the MR LNG project. So the energy cooperation between the two countries was discussed mainly related in this project. And this is, I think, this is different from the discussions in the 2013. And the other issues is about the sea routes. About the sea routes, we mentioned this is also a very hot topic in the 2013 and so on. But in 2018, there are more detailed about the cooperations and more plans about the cooperation between the two countries. Then is the 2019 and 2020 about the published articles. The 2020 is a big transition for the Chinese scholars focusing on the two countries cooperation in the Arctic. More and more scholars began to discuss the strategic issues about the two countries cooperation. More specifically is the geopolitical issues and the China, Russia, and U.S. relations, especially on the background of the the China and U.S. relations began to not very good, and China and Russia and the U.S. relations have not a good relation for a long time. It's an interesting thing. In the 2020, more and more articles, I mean the published articles, open published articles, focus on this issue, the geopolitical issues of the geopolitical topics about the two countries' cooperation in this region. It's very interesting, and at the same time, the numbers of the articles began to more and more. But if we look back at those process, we can make the 2018 is a point for from that year. The discussions and the papers about the two countries' cooperation in the Arctic have had an explosive increase, and this is the big evolution about this topic, and about those topics, and the Chinese scholars, Chinese academics usually mentioned three things. The first is why the two countries can cooperate in the Arctic. They mainly discussed the following points. They discussed what kind of interests the two countries can get from their cooperation in this region, like the economic interests. Usually is the economic, is the energy trade, and some scholars also mentioned the Far East development between the two countries, and they also mentioned the environmental issues, the environmental protection, something like that, and there is the security and the strategic interest for the two countries' cooperation in the region. Especially, they said that this kind of cooperation is a new agenda for the two country relations when they face the U.S. and sometimes some scholars mentioned is one area that two countries can cooperate together to face the pressure from the West. And as some other scholars have mentioned these issues in the last panel and this panel, I will not detail this a lot. And then is the Chinese and Chinese scholars also mentioned a lot and explored what China can do for the cooperation. They usually have two, can be divided into two parts. For China, that means China can take part in the Arctic energy, exploring, infrastructure building, science research, region building, and so on. The Arctic energy, as we know, there are a lot of discussions. The Amara energy, LNG, and the infrastructure mainly related with the ports, the seaport building in this region. And some scholars advised the Chinese enterprises can take part in those kinds of infrastructure buildings to improvement the situation about the northern sea route. And the science research is, the two countries have a long history in this kind of cooperation. And the new thing is the region building for the two countries. And the Chinese scholars also mentioned the two countries can cooperate on the regime building. That means the international regime about the Arctic governance. And the Arctic governance is also China's main interest of China's marriage interest thing, according to the past several articles, and especially if you look at the China Arctic policy, the Chinese government's white paper issued in 2018, and this was put on a very important policy, a very important place for the Chinese policy. And the second is China's interest and China's role in those kind of cooperation is weak. This kind of discussion mentioned that compared with Russia, compared with some Nordic countries, Canada and the US, China's role in the Arctic governance is not very strong because its resources, its history in this region, and its technology, something like that. And a lot of conclusion mentioned that China's to take part in this region, China's role in this region is depending on the Russia's attitude and policy. I think several discussions have mentioned this before my presentation, and that means if Russia is not very active about China's role in this region, so China will face a very strong obstacle to take part in these regions. That means for their cooperation and for the two countries' cooperation in this region, China is not like some fields of the two countries' relations. Its role is not very strong. And then is the very interesting is some discussions about the role of local actors, especially the Chinese local governments, like the Northeast China, and like the Heilongjiang province, etc. Those discussions talked about what kind of role those local actors can play in the two countries' cooperation in the Arctic region. And this mainly because those regions' special role in the Sino-Russian relations. As we know, that Northeast China and Russia have the borderline, and the Heilongjiang province play a major local role in the two countries' cooperation. So from those local actors' perspective, they can play a very important role for the two countries' Arctic cooperation, but their opinions mainly based on their cooperation between their own region and Russia's Far East. And for my understanding, it's not very creative and not very real, but it's very interesting. And the other thing is the challenges for those cooperation. That means the challenge, what kind of challenges for the two countries' Arctic cooperation, and this kind of discussion is very popular for China's academia, a lot of discussion mentioned this, and usually they the following idea is the following ideas are very typical for the Chinese thinking about those issues. The first is multilateral political challenges. That means this distrust between the two country relations in the Arctic areas. I think some other scholars have mentioned some worries Russia's have for the China's take part in this region. I mean, in the Arctic affairs, and also mentioned some Chinese unique interest in this region, but not similar with China, and not similar with Russia. The other is the economic and technological risks. That means for the this opinion mainly about the China's investment in the Arctic, for like mentioned earlier, is for the infrastructure building, for the sea route development, something like that. They said this kind of investment faced a lot of law issues, maybe environmental issues, maybe some the business environment issues. So the pay of those investments is not very much, and also in a very high risk. So for the two countries cooperation in the Arctic regions, mainly the enterprises, the economic investments in this region maybe have faced a lot of challenges. And the third is the skeptical mindset, like the two countries have, like Russia have its own policy, have his not and its policy is not very inclusive for the Arctic affairs. So the China's take part in China's participation will touch the will against the Russia's interests in some content in this region. And the last one is maybe is not last one, but very typical one is and some other practical obstacles, like how the China can take part in the international the Arctic Council, something like that. And the last topic the Chinese scholars mentioned is the approaches to deepen China-Russia cooperation in the Arctic region. And this is also a very typical ideas about these issues. Is the first is the guided by the sustainable development. The sustainable development is the China's is a principle, is the is a primary principle for the China's Arctic policy. And if we look at the China's Arctic policy, the white paper of China's Arctic policy, we can see the Chinese government put this principle in a very, very important place. So, so the Chinese scholars advise for the two countries cooperation, they put this on the first place. And the second is to promote the major project modularization. And this is related with the risks of such kind of cooperation. And one very interesting advice is they suggest the state-owned company, the Chinese state-owned company can play the main role in this kind of investment, like in infrastructure, like in the energy projects. And because for the private companies, this kind of investment will take a long time and not profit in a short term. So they are not probable to invest in these projects. So some advices is that the state-owned companies can take the leading role in this kind of cooperation. And the third is the mission that introduced the multilateral participation. Although the Russia and China have some symmetries and at the same time they have some differences, but as we know, the Arctic affairs is not only China and Russia's issues. There's also a lot of the other players in this region. So the Chinese policy for the Arctic cooperation is part of the multilateral cooperation. In other words, use the international regime, the multilateral regime, to when the two countries have the bilateral cooperations. And the last one is attach great importance to the guiding role of scientific research and technology support. This advice is also very typical compared with some other Chinese scholars' advice for the two countries' cooperation. And that means besides the energy cooperation, besides some infrastructure cooperation, although there are a lot of discussion, the reality of the two countries' cooperation in the infrastructure, into the sea route cooperation is not very clear, and there are few projects that two countries can hold to improve their cooperation, like the Northern Sea route. This kind of sea route issues can, as I mentioned, it was discussed before the 2013, but until now, the Northern Sea route although it's very hot topic, its capacity is not very strong, especially for China and Europe transportation, and it's not only its role. The Northern Sea route role in this region is not very clear, and until now. So that's the very that's also the very typical idea about the two countries' cooperation. So then I will end up here, and I hope we can have more discussion later. Thank you very much.
Спасибо, доктор Мабин.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mar. Our next speaker is Timo Koivunova, professor of Lapland University. Dr. Koivunova, I have a question for you. What trends prevail in the Arctic today? Cooperation or competition? Or do you think these two trends kind of coexist in this region?
Can you hear me?
Да, мы вас слышим.
Yep. Okay. Greetings from Rovaniemi, Finland. So I'm going to be looking at the power politics or peaceful international cooperation. What's happening in the Arctic as a kind of general theme. Next slide, please. Next slide, or do I have the, yeah. So I'm looking at why the Arctic international cooperation has continued and even intensified, even though the great power rivalry affects the Arctic as well. A kind of theming contradiction or a paradox. Next slide, please. And then I will progress in this way. So I will first look at the general picture of great power rivalry, then how it affects the Arctic region. Then that at the same time, it seems that this international cooperation has also intensified in the region. Then how to explain this, and then I draw some conclusions. Next slide. Yes, and the next. So the current state of international relations is now moving to cause international order based on multilateralism to deteriorate. This is the kind of current direction, clearly. Great powers are now playing a stronger role in the international system. This is evident in the way the United States is now trying to contain the rise of China everywhere in the globe. This is seen by many as the US trying to maintain its role as the dominant superpower. The relations between Russia and the Western Western powers, the US-led NATO and the European Union, have also been deteriorating, at least from the time when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, and the sanctions regime started to function in both ways. Currently, there are many problematic issues in the relations between Russia and the Western powers, from Ukraine to Syria to Belarus, etc., etc., etc. Next slide, please. And the next one. So these problematic great power relations manifest themselves also in the Arctic region. And I would still emphasize that, in my view, they are very largely perceptional, that there's not that much happening in the kind of physical reality in the Arctic. This has been especially clear in the relations between Russia and the other 7 members of the Arctic Council. The latter, which can also be said to belong to the Western camp. So all these 7 are either NATO or European Union member states, or both. After the annexation of Crimea, the Western states enacted sanctions against Russia, and Russia counter-sanctioned. Some of these sanctions also hitting on Arctic energy development. In addition, Russia pulled out of military cooperation networks, such as the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable, which is still continuing, and the cooperation between the Arctic Chiefs of Defense Staff. That was totally discontinued. The US is currently trying to challenge China everywhere in the world, as we are reading from the newspapers, including in the Arctic. And the policy towards China is clearly bipartisan. So this is supported by both parties in the United States. China's presence in the Arctic has grown in terms of its scientific and economic investments, but it is still at a fairly low level. We made a comprehensive assessment of Chinese presence in the Arctic region to our government. It's also published in a web, and the actual presence is fairly low still. Perhaps the most conspicuous of its investments in the Yamal is the Yamal LNG development. Yet, especially the United States has suspected China of acting only with the aim of enhancing its power and potentially acting irresponsibly, like in the other parts of the world. And perhaps here I could also take a little bit issue with this this argument about China arguing that the Arctic would be some kind of a heritage of mankind place. That was perhaps at the beginning when China made its inroads into the Arctic cooperation, but in the more recent years, China has, of course, as an observer to the Arctic Council, it is respecting publicly respecting the sovereign rights and sovereign maritime rights of the Arctic states, plus the Law of the Sea Convention in the Arctic Ocean. Next slide, please. Pompeo's speech in my hometown in 2019. So this was ending the Finnish chairmanship of the Arctic Council here in Rovaniemi, and just one day before the actual foreign ministers meeting, Secretary of State wanted to have have a kind of a platform to argue his differences with Russia and China. So he accused both Russia and China in behaving irresponsibly in the region. He raised a concern about Russia's increased militarization of the Arctic region, and also that the rules it had devised for the Northern Sea route, that those are illegal in international law. Pompeo also took up the idea that Russian action in the Arctic can turn violent, in his own words, given their aggressive action in Ukraine. On a similar vein, Pompeo expressed the American concern about Chinese making strategic investments in the Arctic to establish a security presence in the region. He also argued that the way Chinese behave in the South China Sea or other parts of the world are likely to be repeated by a country also in the Arctic, which we, in our study, we didn't find much evidence about that. So China was very much kind of attuning to this very different geopolitical region if you compare that to the South China Sea, where basically China is in its backyard. Next slide, please. And then the next. So during the same last 15 years of deteriorating relations between major powers, as we have witnessed, we have also witnessed increasingly ambitious international cooperation in the Arctic region. The main standing intergovernmental forum, the Arctic Council, has continued to develop, even if during the Trump era, there were clear problems between member states, especially relating to climate change, and indeed those were the crux of the matter also here in the foreign ministers meeting. I was witnessing those from a very close up. Yet now it seems that the Arctic Council cooperation with Russia as the current chair moves forward very well. The Council has become overall more ambitious in its action and has been able to catalyze the 3 legally binding agreements between the 8 Arctic states on search and rescue. This was concluded in 2011. Oil spill preparedness and response 2013, and Arctic scientific cooperation 2017. The Arctic Council has also catalyzed these independent organizations for the Arctic Economic Council, Arctic Coast Guard Forum, and such. Other regulatory processes relevant in the region have also been moving forward in especially maritime dimension. And here I would also take issue with the idea of the Arctic Ocean being somehow comparable to the South China Sea, when we have very clear sovereignty over the land areas and sovereign rights over the marine areas. So it does seem a little bit uneasy for me to somehow see the Arctic Ocean similar to the South China Sea. The legally binding rules for Arctic shipping were negotiated under the auspices of the International Maritime Organization from 2010 onwards. So there was a long period of negotiations, which then ended up entering into force in 2017. So these also regulate shipping in the Arctic, also beyond areas of national jurisdiction. So again, here you have to be very cautious about this Article 234. So it is being used by Canada and Russia, not the others, and other areas are being governed by the Polar Code. The 5 Arctic Ocean coastal states, so we are talking now about Canada, Russia, US, Norway, and Denmark, commenced negotiations, and that was also in 2010, on how to regulate potential future high seas fishing in the high seas portion of the Central Arctic Ocean. So this is a 2.8 million square kilometer high seas area in the middle of the Central Arctic Ocean. They first did their kind of preliminary negotiations, adopted the so-called Oslo Declaration in 2015, And then they finally invited China, Japan, South Korea, Iceland, and the European Union for further negotiations, because these were the entities and states who could actually do fishing in the high seas portion of the Arctic Ocean. They concluded an agreement halting any commercial fishing for 16 years from the day when the legally binding agreement enters into force. It entered into force now in June 2021. Now there is a science body looking into the very heavily transforming ecosystems of those high seas areas of the Central Arctic Ocean. In addition, the continental shelf delineation, and this should be a kind of matter of high-stake politics, and possible delimitation has progressed in a very constructive fashion, exactly how the Law of the Sea Convention prescribes the states to continue with that. And actually, Russia behaving very much ideally from the viewpoint of the Law of the Sea Convention. It's also the case that even though the relations between Russia and the European Union are rather tense, and Russia has been skeptical about the EU's involvement in Arctic cooperation, at the same time, Russia and the EU actually cooperate very well on many technical issues that are highly Arctic relevant. For instance, forest fires, data systems, as we have seen there are a lot of forest fires in the Arctic region, or emergency response management. And there were many areas of cooperation that we also found when we did a study to the EU's Commission on EU's kind of current presence in the Arctic region. Then next slide, please. And then the next one, how to explain this. So how is it possible to have these kind of major geopolitical tensions, at least perceptual, between the major powers also in their Arctic relations, and at the same time experience constructive cooperation where all those powers are involved? It seems fairly clear that cooperation on issues of shared interest can continue even when geopolitical tensions are high. Even in the context of serious tensions during the Cold War between the camps led by Soviet Union and the United States, it was possible to cooperate, for instance, in the Antarctica, participate in making very ambitious rules on the Law of the Sea Convention, which is called the Constitution of the Oceans, or the polar bear, protecting the polar bear in the Arctic, between the Arctic Ocean coastal states, or have fisheries cooperation between NATO member Norway and Soviet Union, very constructive during the Cold War times. And just to say my opinion on the Cold War, I think it was one of the major strategic confrontation places between the US and the USSR at the time, simply because they were closest to each other, and the kind of nuclear threat was most apparent in the Arctic, and of course the submarines were there all the time underneath the sea ice. Given that the world we are nowadays living is economically very interdependent, even if we have this kind of deteriorating great power relations, the economies are heavily interdependent. It is to be presumed that there are many areas of cooperation that can still be continued when the shared interest of states are there. It should also be remembered that no state is a monolith, but functions via many ministries and local agencies with established international cooperation structures. Many of these are likely to continue if no significant escalation of conflict is to take place. It's mostly in the case of really significant conflict when the decision making is concentrated only on the hands of very few. Next slide, please. So this need for cooperation is even more clear in the Arctic, given that this is a region where infrastructure and resources are scarce and all operations very expensive. So states really need each other. and where states can learn from each other how to deal with similar type of challenges. At the same time, even if overall tensions are high, these states can maintain a level of cooperation and build trust, which is important in itself. All dialogue is important during tensions, but also for the development of future relations. The difficulty currently exists between, for instance, Arctic Council cooperation, which seems that the US and Russia have again found themselves after this very difficult Trump era, when Trump was really kind of downscaling or targeting the climate cooperation. And the problem is now that there are entities like China participating in the Arctic Council cooperation. Even if China, EU, they have lots to give to the Arctic Council cooperation. There's an ongoing kind of discussion about the kind of engagement of observers in the work of the Arctic Council. It is also the case that especially China is now being challenged by the United States, which means that Arctic cooperative relation towards China needs to be managed carefully, so to safeguard the existing Arctic Council cooperation. I think that we are seeing that Biden, again, in a very similar way, is continuing this kind of containing China. And to some extent, I think that it will also influence Arctic Council cooperation. But it has also influence in our part of the world, all kinds of strategic investments in multiple states. And the next one. So some conclusions. It seems fairly clear that the Arctic international cooperation is likely to contain both elements of great power politics and international cooperation between the region's states, with some involvement from outside the Arctic. Even if the tensions grow easier, it seems also possible to engage in even more ambitious Arctic international governance, but also the reverse is obviously possible. It should be kept in mind that what we see and hear normally from the Arctic is likely to be either the narrative of great power politics or stronger international cooperation, simply because it is easier to communicate a one-sided view of what is happening in the Arctic, and we can see that this from the news media. This is still unfortunate, as these one-sided views do not represent what is taking place in the Arctic region. Thank you very much.
Спасибо, доктор Кайвурова, за ваше содержательное.
Thank you, Dr. Koivurova, for your presentation. Unfortunately, with such interesting speakers, time usually flies, and we only have a couple of minutes in this session. But if Anna doesn't mind, and we still have time, I still would like to give our participants a chance to ask at least one or two questions. We will certainly do that. Thank you, Natalia. Okay, let me figure this one out. I think I will put several questions into one big question. Yelena, your question. Thank you very much. Hello. I would like to thank all the speakers for their presentations. And my question goes to Mr. Suslov. Mr. Suslov, what do you think about the prospects of the new START treaty and how this may affect the situation in the Arctic? Should the Arctic matters be included in the matters of strategic stability in the 21st century? Thank you. Okay, this was the first question. The second question.
I have a question to Professor Ma. China has for a long time been experiencing or expressing its interest in using the Northern Sea route. And indeed, in March of this year, the Bingshang's Sichuan Zhilu was for the first time included in the 5-year plan. Do you think that some measures of state support will follow the inclusion in the 5-year plan? Thanks.
Давайте справедливости ради, если у кого-то есть вопрос к профессору Кайвурову.
Okay, to be fair, does anybody have a question for Professor Koivurova so we get all our 3 speakers involved? I don't see anybody at this point. Okay, Sergey. I do have a question for Timo Koivorova. And my question is as follows. What do you think about the prospects of cooperation? Do you think the Arctic cooperation can be expanded to other matters of regional cooperation between Arctic Council members? Okay, let's start with Mr. Suslov and his question. Thank you very much for your question. I'm very pessimistic about the possibility of extending, signing the New START treaty because of fundamental differences between Russia and the United States. The United States wants to sign a treaty that would limit all the nuclear weapons, both strategic and non-strategic. And the United States is interested primarily in limiting Russian tactical, sub-strategic, non-strategic nuclear weapons. But Russia, for its part, wants to establish what Russia calls security equation with the United States and limit all strategic nuclear weapons according to this security equation. Bring all the strategic and non-strategic and non-nuclear conventional arms into this security equation, because conventional weapons can play a strategic role now. And most probably we won't be able to resolve this contradiction. I think the best we can do as far as new treaty is concerned is we can just extend the current New START treaty for another period, keep limits where they are, and maybe add a few new systems there, like hypersonic nuclear delivery vehicles that can be included in the category of strategic offensive weapons. But it's great that we do have strategic stability talks between Russia and the United States. Now, as regards the Arctic, and the Arctic, of course, plays a big role in strategic stability, including nuclear weapons. It is the Arctic where Russian submarines are based. Arctic is the territory where intercontinental ballistic missiles will be flying over. Hopefully this never happens, of course. So as we see that this rivalry between great powers spills into the Arctic and we see militarization of the Arctic, we do need to strengthen deconflicting measures. We do need to mitigate risks of military accidents, dangerous, inadvertent military accidents, and we need to work out the rules of the game. And Arctic countries definitely should engage in deconfliction talks to reduce the risk of inadvertent military accidents. But this has to be done outside the Arctic Council. This should not be part of the Arctic Council agenda. I think Russia's proposal that Arctic countries should resume talks on hard security issues, on military matters, between chiefs of staff, between general staffs. This is a good idea, but this should be done outside the Arctic Council. Don't confuse these two things. Hard security and soft security are separate matters. They should be treated separately. Don't bring this into the Arctic Council, because this will paralyze the work of the Arctic Council. I totally agree with Professor Koivorova. I think the Arctic Council still works. It is still effective. It works nicely. And the reason for that is because the chairman countries of the Arctic Council, including Russia, resist attempts to bring in hard security matters into the work of the Arctic Council. And very briefly, I would like to add a few words to what Timo Koivorov said about differences between the Arctic and the South China Sea. You know, when I talked about South China Sea, and I said this was an example of what we could see in the Arctic, I was not referring to territorial disputes. I was talking about the behavior of great powers, you know, practical actions by great powers. We may see something similar to that in the Arctic, because the United States rejects Russia's ambitions and Russia's claims about Article 234, saying that Russia can control the Northern Sea route and the Arctic Ocean waters within 200 miles. The United States insists that this is a challenge, a threat to international law. This is something that undermines international world order in the Arctic. And the United States insists that it will insist on freedom of navigation. And this is exactly what the United States does in the South China Sea. They insist on freedom of navigation. Essentially, this means that the United States is going to ignore Russia's position and insist on having its presence in the 200-mile zone off the Russian coast. And this will create severe risks of military accidents.
Спасибо, доктор.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Ma, over to you.
Okay. To be briefly, I have 3 points about the 5 years plan and the BRI in the new short term. And the point number 1 is in the next 5 years, the BRI will still be the great framework of China's cooperation with the other countries, especially on the economic cooperation. Point number 2, and a BRI is still in the progress of shaping. It's not a very stable and a clear framework in the past several years. After 5 years later, maybe almost 5 years later, the BRI will be, we might see a new BRI and the new contents about the BRI. And point number 3, and the BRI will become more and in the next 5 years, so the short term, the BRI will what we can see is more and more concentrate on the specific fields and specific projects. It's not like we say in the past several years. It's so broad. It includes everything, and in my opinion, this phenomena will be end, or at least it will be changed. Thank you very much.
Спасибо, профессор Кайвурова.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So can Arctic cooperation be extended to other areas of cooperation? So I would say that currently there are no new ideas for at least no kind of legally binding agreements are on the making. But I think that it's also a case that the Arctic Council is trying to digest all what it has created in the past 10 years or so. So that's also a kind of digestion period. One trend that I'm seeing at the moment is that the Arctic Council is heavily trying to find its kind of role in managing the high seas of the Central Arctic Ocean, simply because there are now global negotiations on how to govern high seas biodiversity that are in the United Nations. And those also They are also relevant for the 2.8 million square kilometer high seas portion of the Central Arctic Ocean. And also that there's the Arctic Council is kind of trying to find whether it could be the kind of regional implementation body, because high seas are obviously for all nations, and somehow the BBNJ kind of a possible treaty would then entail a role perhaps for the Arctic Council or for some other constellation of states, perhaps for the Arctic 5. So this is something that the Arctic Council is now kind of actively exploring its role there. And just to also to answer to Dmitry about this South China Sea, I think that I'm also kind of I'm kind of sick and tired of this kind of South China Sea comparison, because obviously the regions are so different. There's no kind of real power over territories as what are really driving the South China Sea dispute, and I don't think that China is really a kind of active player in the Arctic Ocean as well. But I think that you very well kind of delineated now what you meant by this kind of from your view, and especially the kind of problem of the possibility of this freedom of seas operations from the part of the United States, and obviously we cannot foreclose those. We know that the US is challenging not only the Northern Sea Route but also the Canadian historic internal waters. So my take on this is that during the Trump era they used some hard words on Northern Sea Route and perhaps doing some kind of freedom of the sea operations. I cannot say that this will not happen, but I do say that I would be extremely surprised if they went somehow to the backyard of Russia to challenge one sea lane, and that would be kind of a very kind of irrational behavior from the part of the US. But as I said, I mean, this is a scenario that I can live with, and this is possibility. Thank you.
Спасибо. У нас есть еще вопрос в чате.
Thank you. We have a question that came through the chat, and very many questions come from the floor. Probably we don't have time for all that. Is my understanding correct that we should wrap it up? Unfortunately, we cannot take any more questions at the moment, but we thought that we would write those questions down, and we will send them to the speakers and ask them to give answers in any format that would be convenient, so that the audience could get better understanding of the matters that people are interested in. Or maybe we can invite people to publish something regarding the questions that will be raised. Now we have a lunch break, and we will talk about the technicalities later. I would like to say thank you to all the presenters that joined us online. We're very happy to have you with us, and we hope that next time we will have an opportunity to meet with you face to face, and this will be definitely a more convenient format. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.